2, and we're going to be looking at canyons, shipwrecks, and seeps as habitat for marine life. I just want to run over a few guidelines for the webinar today. We will be, and we are, recording this session, and all of you will be in attendee mode and muted by the organizers so that we don't get background noise. So please use the question box for anything that you would like to ask us or to communicate any of your technical concerns. We're happy to have you with us today. And I would like first to introduce the chair of our Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, Ms. Keisha Santiago Martinez. So hi, Keisha, and I'm going to let you say some nice introductions for us.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone back to our Live in the Deep Sea webinar series. If this is your first time, you're in for quite a treat. If you missed the first webinar in the series, which covered how predators utilize mid-Atlantic canyon habitat, you can view a recording on the Marco's website. And to make it easier, we'll definitely be sharing a link in a follow-up email. Marco is the regional partnership for the Mid-Atlantic. Established in 2009 by the governors of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Marco is an interstate collaboration to address shared regional priorities and to provide a collective voice on important ocean issues that transcend political borders. Marco focuses on 4 shared regional priorities in the Mid-Atlantic: climate change adaptation, water quality, marine habitats, and renewable energy. Millions of people live along the Atlantic coast and spend time recreating on our beaches and shores. Yet so few people know that far offshore lie some of the most majestic, remarkable features in our oceans. Deep sea canyons run along the underwater coast of the Mid-Atlantic and provide vital habitat to ancient corals and other unique species who would otherwise have difficulty thriving in the cold, dark environment. Studying these fragile habitats and the hidden and unusual species that live in them is important to understand how our decisions and daily behavior can impact little-known areas of the ocean far away and unseen. Today, we will explore natural and human-influenced habitat in the deep sea and the animals that live there. I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Steve Ross, whose research on unique deep water ecosystems, such as the deep sea canyons, has illuminated the ecological value of these systems. Before I turn things back over to Laura, I would also like to thank the incredible Marco staff and team who has been doing such a great job bringing wonderful research, images, and discussions together, as well as the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for their support, which has allowed Marco time and time to continue to work on collaborative projects. Thank you all so much again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our final webinar of the series on November 5th, Canyons as Important Whale Habitat. Thanks, Laura. I'll turn it over back to you.
Thanks so much, Keisha, and we all thank you for your leadership of Marco these past 2 years. You've been great, so we all appreciate it. So let's move right along, and I do want to introduce Dr. Steve Ross. He is a research professor. He's currently semi-retired, so we're very glad that he's still with us today to do this webinar and still doing his good work. He is at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, their Center for Marine Science, and he's a native of North Carolina, spent most of his 35-plus year career involved in marine science in the Atlantic Basin. He has a bachelor's in zoology from Duke University, a master's from UNC Chapel Hill, and a PhD from North Carolina State University. And he specializes in ichthyology, fishes, particularly the areas of ecology and life history. And he's conducted projects in rivers, estuaries, and offshore waters, including 44 cruises, mainly using submersibles and ROVs, and hopefully we'll see some of that footage today. He's authored over 100 articles in scientific journals and books and has won awards for several of his projects. And his current work involves ecological assessments of unique deep water ecosystems off the southeastern US and the Gulf of Mexico and in the Mid-Atlantic Bight. Also off Canada, and in particular, energy flow, trophodynamics, and relationships of animals to various habitats, including coral banks, shipwrecks, canyon systems, seeps, and rocky areas. So thank you so much for being with us today, Steve, and we can't wait to see your presentation.
Very good. Thank you very much, Laura, and thank all the people that are attending this. It's fairly strange to give a talk without being able to see the audience. So I'm making assumptions that you can see and hear me clearly. And I'll do the best I can to move through these slides and explain some of the work that we've been doing over the last 8 or 10 years. I'll emphasize mid-Atlantic canyons, but we're also going to talk about shipwrecks and methane seeps. And the general theme here is concerning complex habitats. So if we think of the open, sandy, fairly flat bottom as being relatively simple, although it is an important habitat, we're going to be talking about something quite different. These are habitats that have been difficult to sample by the scientific community, and we're just now starting to understand how important these areas are. So let me set the stage by saying that we're mostly talking about the region called the Mid-Atlantic Bight, which runs roughly from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and I'll use my cursor here as a pointer, up to Cape Cod. And this area is one of the best known regions in U.S. territorial waters, and that's largely because there have been important fisheries here for hundreds of years. And where there are fisheries, the science generally follows. However, as you move to deeper water, past 200 and 300 meters, the amount of knowledge that we have declines very rapidly. So all these little red areas here are submarine canyons. The Mid-Atlantic area is known as a region of submarine canyons. And most of us are familiar with what a canyon looks like, and these look very similar to a feature like the Grand Canyon. Most of our data that we've had in the past came from traditional sampling methods, and these methods are not good for working in canyons and around corals and around rocky areas. So we've had to come up with different technology to investigate these sites. So what does a canyon do? It basically intersects as sort of a passageway from the shallower shelf down to the abyssal plain. So it's basically a funnel that allows material to move back and forth, mostly downhill, but also water movement is up and down the canyons. They provide a unique habitat, which is a shelter and refuge for a number of animals. They provide food resources. There are enhanced feeding opportunities here. They concentrate biological diversity because of these enhanced feeding opportunities and enhanced habitats, and they consequently support important commercial fisheries. There are probably 30 or 40 canyons in the Mid-Atlantic Bight, and these go even beyond the Mid-Atlantic Bight all the way up to Canada. There's a large canyon up here where we've worked recently off Nova Scotia. And they range in size from features as large as the Grand Canyon to small ditches that you could jump over. So there's quite a range of canyon expression here. So just before we get into some of the data, I wanted to touch briefly on how we do some of this work. And our ability to understand the deep sea has improved dramatically over the last couple of decades. We've had tremendous improvements in our instrumentation. Our sonars are better, our environmental data recorders are better. We certainly have better cameras. Almost everybody's familiar now that we have 4K and 8K cameras producing incredible detail. In addition to field methods, our lab methods are better. We have a tremendous amount of computing power now and improved software. Advances in genetic techniques allow us to investigate the relationships among species, but also among populations. And we have vastly improved communications, and now many of our research ships can actually send back data and video and information to both the public and the scientific community, allowing education opportunities and also increased research opportunities. One of the tools that I like to talk about first that's greatly improved our ability to understand the deep sea is just simply producing better maps. In the past, we used what was called a single beam sonar. Here's just a single beam of sound that goes down to the bottom and reflects back up, and we can measure the depth of the water. And you can probably understand pretty quickly that this is a tedious way to map the bottom, and in fact is not even practical for mapping large features. But now we have something called multi-beam sonar that's increasingly important and used on many ships. And we can send as many as 100 beams of sound down at the same time. And depending on the water depth, we can map swaths of the bottom as much as a kilometer wide. So now, in the space of a few days or a week, we can map vast amounts of territory. And we can produce maps like these over to the right, that or a coral mound off of Cape Fear, North Carolina. And having these three-dimensional sort of data sets, we can rotate the maps around and look at them from different sides, but we can also overlay biological data and physical data on these maps to get a better understanding of how these systems work. So, but even with these really significant advances in our tools, we've mapped relatively little of the bottom. As of 2010, this is what we had mapped with multi-beam sonar off the southeastern US. And that was mostly searching for deep sea coral ecosystems. And you can see it's not a whole lot of territory. That's improved now. 2010 was some time ago. One of the things I've often pointed out, I'm sure you've heard, is that we probably know more about the backside of the moon than we do the deep sea. That's changing, but it's still to some extent true. Now, of course, the moon is a very simple sort of place. You know, there's not ocean and there's not life, but it is difficult to get to and it's expensive. But the amount of territory that we had mapped off the southeastern US would only amount to this small dot on the moon's surface, and we've mapped the whole surface of the moons. Let's skip back up to our area at the mid-Atlantic, and we can see that as of 2015, we had multiple cruises using multiple ships, and we've now mapped a significant amount of the continental slope. And you can see some of the canyon features here. I believe, let's see, this is Norfolk Canyon and Baltimore Canyon is here. This large feature is Hudson Canyon. So now we're starting to make quite a lot of progress in these maps, and this kind of data produces these beautiful images of the bottom in much more detail than we've ever had before. And we can use this to improve our research cruises, to improve our planning for research, but also it improves our understanding of the data that we collect. So for instance, when we collect physical oceanographic data about the water movement up and down this canyon, we now have a detailed picture of the morphology of the canyon. We understand that Norfolk Canyon now has this significant bend to the west, and we have more detail about that than we did in the past, and that helps explain why some of the oceanography in Norfolk Canyon is different from some of the other places that we've worked. You know, if we wanted to go pick a place to look for deep sea corals, we would want a rugged bottom, and this area over here is what we would investigate. And in fact, when we did look at this area, we found quite a lot of deep sea coral. So these maps are an incredibly important resource. And just in one cruise in 2011, we were able to map over 500 square miles of bottom. So this is quite an effective tool, and it also allowed us to identify a number of shipwrecks. So these are very useful. And so another one of these images, and I'm going to end with these pretty quickly. This is the largest canyon on the East Coast or in the Gulf of Mexico. And it extends from Hudson River out to 3,000 or 4,000 meters of depth at least. And it's a very large canyon, but even for its size, it's been poorly studied so far. And we're starting to try to take an interest in Hudson Canyon. Just last month, OceanGate used their 5-person submarine, the Cyclops, to make a dive in the upper area up in here of Hudson Canyon. They have a YouTube of that dive, and they'll be trying to dive again in October in this month. And we'll be working with OceanGate over the next few years to try to gain additional information about this area. So I mentioned that we're like the Cyclops, we have used manned submersibles in quite a lot of our work, but increasingly now, we're moving toward remote operated vehicles like these two here. These vehicles are tethered to the ship, which limits their mobility and to some extent limits when you can use them in terms of weather, but they have unlimited power, which means they have unlimited lighting and almost unlimited bottom time. So we can gather quite a lot of data with these platforms. All of these vehicles have sophisticated camera systems as here and here. On the front of this vehicle, they have manipulator arms. They have suction devices. You see a hose here going down into a series of acrylic containers to contain samples. So these are multi-instrument platforms. We have recorders on these vehicles that measure a variety of ocean conditions. So they come back to the surface packed full of data and information that sometimes takes us years to unravel. One of the tools that we've started to use a lot more frequently are Benthiclanders. These are a couple of landers that we designed and built in my laboratory. We put these platforms on the bottom for as much as a year. They have a variety of instruments that measure basic conditions of the water on the bottom, current speeds and directions, salinity, temperature, oxygen, turbidity, or a lot of parameters that are important to the biology. We also have acrylic chambers that we can put living experiments in. There's a sediment trap in the center of these that accumulate material that falls to the bottom, and that can be analyzed. And I'm not going to belabor a lot of complicated data in this talk, but this is an example over here on the right of a year's worth of data from Norfolk Canyon, collected at about a little over 1,300 meters depth. And you can see it's kind of a busy graph, but what it shows is a tremendous amount of variability in water parameters. And this shaded area here is the time period when Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy passed over our area, the 29th of October, 2012. And you can see that there are spikes here in fluorescent material, and that means that there's been a deposition of material from the water column to the bottom. You can see an increase in turbidity, and that of course makes sense if the current speeds are increased because of the storm. A slight decrease in salinity and some variability in temperature. So now this kind of tool allows us to match up things that are going on the surface with things that are going on very deep in the water column. And we see that there's a lot more connection than what we might have thought. In the past, all we had were occasional data points all along this kind of graph during a year. And it was difficult to put together a picture of the environment, but with these kinds of instruments and long-term recording, this is the kind of environment that the animals are actually experiencing. So this is much more important data, much more powerful data for analyzing what's going on with the biology. And we use a variety of different kinds of research ships in our work and traditional sorts of gear. This is called a CTD mechanism, stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth. And it also records other things like turbidity and dissolved oxygen and fluorescence. And it also has these gray bottles. We can collect water samples at different depths. So we use this throughout our cruises. This is a instrument that is lowered to the bottom and takes an undisturbed sample of the sediment. The sediment can be analyzed both for biology and its chemistry. This is a box core. And we use some gear that hasn't changed much in several hundred years, which is just a towed net. This is an otter trawl that samples the bottom. This is called a tucker trawl. It's an opening and closing net that samples the mid-water column. So a lot of the time when we go to sea, we're sampling the whole environment from surface to bottom, and we're working 24 hours a day, and there's a tremendous amount of material that's collected in these cruises. So let's talk a little bit about some of the biology that we've discovered. Our most intense studies probably to date have come from Norfolk and Baltimore Canyon. These are two of the canyons that have been examined the most. During a 2-year study, we found about 123 species of fish. 12 of these were new to the area. That's not unusual when you're working in a deep sea environment to discover things that haven't been seen before. But one of the things that's significant about that number is it's more fish than has generally been reported in a lot of previous studies. And that's because we used a variety of sampling methods, and we actually got to the bottom with video cameras, and we could see things that you couldn't find with traditional kinds of sampling gear. So using a lot of methods and looking at a number of different habitats, we find out that there's considerable diversity in the fish community. We found out from our data analysis that there were 3 basic depth patterns, a group of fish that generally stayed around shallower waters above 700, 800 meters. And there's generally a group of deep water fishes that were restricted to depths below about 1,000 or 1,200 meters. And then there were some that ranged over the whole area. Understanding these community patterns is important in terms of managing these species later on, if there are fisheries that develop, and in terms of understanding the flow of energy back and forth across different types of ecosystems. Most of what we found was a lot of these fish exhibited very strong habitat associations. They had a strong preference for sand, or they had a strong preference for these complex bottoms, say with corals or rocks. And that's not something that had been really well appreciated in deep sea research, that the fish have the same kinds of habitat affinity that some of the fish have in shallow water. And many of these are commercially important species. As example, these 4 fish across the top are commercially important. The goosefish, you may have heard of this fish often in the north, especially it's called the monkfish. It's very good eating, and most of the time what you see in the market is just the tail section back here. You do not see this big ugly head. And that may be off-putting if you were to see that in a market, but notice that this fish has upturned eyes and a large mouth. It sits on the bottom and waits for something to swim by, and it can eat a very large animal. These are quite abundant in the deep sea canyon areas. The cusk is somewhat overfished, but this is an important species throughout the North Atlantic. It occurs in European waters in the Eastern Atlantic all the way across to our side. We found it, I'll say a little bit more about this later. Black belly rosefish is another species that's quite common on both sides of the Atlantic. It's used commercially over on the European side more than here, but still is a commercially important species. It's in the scorpionfish family, so it's related to a number of other commercially important species. Wreckfish is a widely ranging fish over the whole Atlantic. It's been fished heavily. Now it's managed there's quite a lot of restrictions on the fisheries, but there's still a fishery off the southeastern U.S. especially. And there are species that roam throughout the whole area, covering all kinds of habitats, like these sharks. Halosaurs and tripod fish are most common, and this cusk eel are most common in the deeper waters. These are representatives of fish that you mostly would see in 1,000 meters. These two nearly always over sandy bottoms. But one of the things that's kind of fun about deep sea fish is that they have just amazing adaptations to this fairly harsh habitat. The tripod fish stands up on these fin extensions and rests on its tail, and it has these pectoral fin extensions that come out over the head. And a lot of these adaptations are related to finding food or avoiding being food. Another example of these kinds of adaptations are this armored sea robin. You see these extensions that come out from the bottom of the jaw. They feel along the bottom, and also with these extensions from the fins. and they can encounter and disturb prey, and as soon as they do, they eat them. So, and same thing with the longfin hake. These long extensions here off the pectoral fins allow this fish to feel along the bottom and look for prey. So a lot of interesting adaptations. So a few more players of some of the more interesting species that we've encountered in the fish world. These 4 fish across the top were not really known from this region until recently. This fish was, I don't think, was known further south than Greenland. So it's an extension down into the mid-Atlantic region from the north. Most of the extensions we see are from the south. This eel was well known in the southeastern U.S. and now we know it extends all the way up to the mid-Atlantic and even down to the Gulf of Mexico. And the reason it had been not discovered before was it occurs in these habitats amongst shells and amongst corals and in crevices that are almost impossible to sample, without going down and looking with these video cameras. So we see, rat tails are quite abundant in this area. This one was a range extension from the Caribbean, but this species is well known throughout the whole east coast of the U.S. Very common rat tail, the marlin spike. Here are 2 examples of fish that almost exclusively occur on sandy bottom, very, very important parts of that sand bottom ecosystem. And the ghost cat shark, I think probably is only known from a handful of specimens that have been collected that are in museums. And yet, when we go down and look at these habitats, this particular photograph, I think, was taken in about 1,300 meters of depth. We find that these animals are not that uncommon. They just escape detection pretty readily. There's an equal amount of diversity and interesting types of adaptations in the invertebrate community. And this slide to the left, is a good illustration of how dense some of the organisms can be. These little white things here are solitary corals, a hard coral. There's some bivalve shells here, like a sort of a clam shell. This is a filter feeding deep sea starfish, a bracingid, what we call a bracingid sea star. And you see this little octopus curled up under the ledge. Now there's very likely a lot more going on here, but we're only showing this one still photo. Anywhere you get these hard, muddy walls, you're very commonly going to get large colonies of coral. This is bubblegum coral in 2 different color types. There's some anemones here. A lot of these white dots in these photos are sponges. The sponge diversity is pretty amazing. And this is one of the more charismatic players in the octopus world, the Dumbo octopus. These are actually fins, but they look sort of like ears to some people, so they called it the Dumbo octopus because it's short little fins, and it basically hangs out in the water column and floats around looking for things to eat. Worldwide, there's been an emphasis on deep sea corals in the last 20 years, increasingly so. And one of the things we've learned is that deep sea corals are probably cover more territory than all the shallow water reefs combined, and they probably include more biodiversity than the shallow water reefs. And that's saying quite a lot, because we've studied shallow water coral reefs for a long time, and they've always been considered, and they still are, a very significant resource. Of course, they're being damaged quite readily now by climate change. So these deep sea coral ecosystems, it turns out, are an important complex habitat. We found at least 20 species of deep sea corals during our project in the canyons. And almost everywhere there was hard bottom, you'd see these fields of corals either hanging on the walls or attached to rocks, like this large bubblegum coral. Now we have these solitary corals. Some are only occur in the sand. This is a primitive coral called a sea pen. This is a hard solitary coral. I'm not sure the common name of it. Phobellum is the genus, but it occurs only in the sand. And these solitary hard corals occur on walls. But there are a lot of differences in the mid-Atlantic. The mid-Atlantic is dominated by these sort of fleshy, pliable kinds of corals. They aren't hard. In the southeastern U.S. and the Gulf of Mexico, the dominant coral are more like these Lophelia pertusa down here at the bottom. We discovered Lophelia pertusa for the first time in the mid-Atlantic during our research, but unlike other places, it only forms these small colonies, often in crevices in the canyons. In other places, this coral can form reefs that are hundreds of meters high and hundreds of meters long. So it's quite a extensive reef building coral worldwide, but it's different in the mid-Atlantic. Black corals were more rare in the mid-Atlantic than elsewhere, so there are differences, and this relates to the different oceanography in the mid-Atlantic and also the different kind of bottom types. There's less rocky material in the mid-Atlantic. So if we think about habitat in terms of scale, to a whale, a whole canyon may be a habitat because that large animal can utilize the whole canyon. To a fish that maybe moves only a few hundred meters and likes to stay around a particular kind of rocky environment, its habitat may be a few hundred square meters. But going down even further in size, we see that a coral colony can be a habitat to these brittle stars, and they can be incredibly dense. These are brittle stars on bubblegum coral. You can see the polyps of the coral are out to feed in this picture, but they're abundant in a lot of these corals. And we found that some of the fish use the corals as a spawning substrate. These little brown rectangles where all these red arrows are cat shark egg cases. So there's a species of cat shark that lays its eggs on these bubblegum and some other corals, and they can be fairly dense. There are other species of fish that lay eggs within the coral matrix here, and here, two egg masses within a coral. So these are important, in a microscopic sense. I'll say just one quick thing about corals. This doesn't necessarily relate to the mid-Atlantic. And besides providing important habitat, some of these corals, especially the black corals, can live to be hundreds to thousands of years old. This particular colony, I think, was aged at somewhere around 1,600 years old. They can be sectioned, and they have rings, just like trees. The rings can be counted. They can also be dated with a variety of other methods. So that's interesting in itself, but they provide a value in that all of these rings, each individual ring can have chemical signatures. And once we learn to understand those chemical signatures, we can unravel a lot of what the past history was during the life of that coral. And this is basically an instrument record that we didn't have from the past. With increasing and rapid climate change and changes in the ocean, this kind of archive is becoming more and more important. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that canyons enhance food, and one of the reasons for that is that canyons are concentrating nutrients. There's potentially upwelling from nutrient-rich waters that are deeper. There's input of nutrients from surface waters, and the canyons can tend to concentrate these nutrients, which supports lots of small invertebrates. These small shrimp-like creatures here can be so dense that they completely blocked out our video cameras on a number of dives. And those in turn attract larger predators, and that attracts larger predators. Short-finned squid are abundant in the canyons. They support commercial fisheries. They're also very active predators. There are different kinds of squid, like this really bizarre looking vampire squid that occur just as usually single individuals, and they hang out in the water column. Red crabs are another commercially important resource that are very common within the canyon area. We see evidence of fishing for those, traps on the bottom. And these are pretty abundant across a wide range of habitats that go from sand to rocky areas. Sea cucumbers are bizarre animals that basically are bottom vacuum cleaners. They roam across the bottom, eating sediments and extracting food materials, and they're an important part of the community that reworks and reworks the sediments. And in some places, these are used as food for humans, not so much in the United States. The sea stars also have a tremendous amount of variability and are active predators. They're always roaming around looking for a meal. This Brisingid sea star, which I showed before, is a filter feeder. These others probably feed a lot on clams and small crabs, whatever they can find on these rocky walls. And of course, every time we encounter an American lobster, the whole crew stops to marvel. One of our favorite food resources, of course. But the American lobster also is a bottom engineer. It can hollow out crevices and holes, and almost everywhere on the bottom we see holes into the walls. Multiple species will use these. We sometimes see 3 or 4 different species of animals crowding into the same hole. This is a squat lobster here. It's the same species, except this is a bigger one over here. Another squat lobster here. These aren't really lobsters or crabs, but they're related. And you can see this black belly rosefish is trying to crowd into that same area. And some of these crustaceans are quite bizarre looking. This is a very small crab. It's very difficult to see unless you zoom into the rocks, and he's hangs out in these small crevices and looks for food. So there's a lot of invertebrate diversity. You see anemones here, lots of filter feeders, and that's an indication that there's a tremendous amount of food material in the water. So we're going to switch real quickly to methane seeps, and I'm going to try to run through this fairly quickly. One of the things that methane seeps are not necessarily associated with canyons, but they can be. And one of the interesting things is we did not know that methane seeps existed in the mid-Atlantic before about 2012, except there was a rumor that one existed. There were very few known from the Eastern Atlantic, and now we think there may be as many as 500 of these things. Methane that's biologically produced in the bottom bubbles up through the surface, and there are bacteria that can use this methane as a food resource. That in turn attracts mussels like these here that can use the bacteria, which in turn attracts other animals, and pretty soon you have a fairly large reef. These carbonate rocks are also a result of these methane processes. You can see now that there are quite a number of these seeps all along the mid-Atlantic, and they also provide complex habitat, and they are vulnerable to impact from fishing. And there's a huge number of animals that use these, as illustrated by these photos here. This carbonate rock that's part of this ecosystem is now crowded with anemones and sponges and a red crab. Fish hover around these. We've got red crabs on these mussel beds and a deep sea spider crab, probably eating the mussels. Large bubblegum corals also associated with the rocks, and here again these crowds of small invertebrates, lots of rich food resource. I mentioned earlier that there's relatively little hard bottom in the mid-Atlantic, and one of the enhancements to hard bottom would be shipwrecks. During one of the biggest concentrations of shipwrecks in the mid-Atlantic is what's called the Billy Mitchell fleet, which was a group of German warships that were given to the United States after World War I. They were anchored just north of Norfolk Canyon in this area, and they were used to demonstrate that early air power could in fact sink warships. So it's a very important demonstration that air power was a viable means of destroying warships. These shipwrecks, even though we knew generally where they were not well located. So we located and mapped all of these during our project working in the Norfolk Canyon. And we've now nominated these shipwrecks as to be a part of the National Register of Historic Places. We have photographs of some of the features of these wrecks when they were on the surface. It's showing a hatch here. This is the same hatch on the bottom. Same thing here. We photographs of what they looked like on the surface, and now on the bottom you see fishing nets that have been around some of these. The fishermen, not knowing exactly where the wrecks were, probably hit these by accident. But you can see these provide quite a lot of structure on the bottom, and they're utilized by a wide number of fishes. We encountered about 38 species of fish during our 2-year survey of these wrecks. And a lot of these were fish that were not well known for the mid-Atlantic. Groupers, the snowy grouper here, and Warsaw grouper, blue line tilefish, and these little fish here, which are in the sea bass family, are mostly fish that are common south of Cape Hatteras. But with climate change and increasing water temperatures, a lot of these fish are moving north. A lot of fish populations are shifting to the north. So now these fish are becoming a very important, potentially a commercial resource on these shipwrecks. You see, almost everywhere you find a hole of the right size, you'll find a conger eel sticking his head out. Black sea bass is another important commercial species in the mid-Atlantic. But one thing I want to point out, which you may not have noticed in these photos unless I do point it out, are these carpeting, these long fish laying all over these wrecks. These are chained dogfish, and I don't know that they've ever been reported in quite this abundance anywhere else. We counted hundreds of these, often laying on top of each other all over these wrecks, and apparently they're using the wrecks as a spawning substrate. So we can see shark egg cases here on the far right. These are all chained dogfish egg cases, and here's a part of a chained dogfish body laying next to them. So now we know, these wrecks are, because there's a lack of hard substrate in the mid-Atlantic, these wrecks are quite an important resource for that. So just to summarize very quickly on the biology end, most of the fish we encountered are wide-ranging. They weren't necessarily restricted to one habitat, but these complex habitats do tend to concentrate biodiversity and host a greater abundance of fishes. And the canyons did display some different fish communities than were on the surrounding slope. The corals and sponges provide additional habitat. The seeps and the associated mussel beds provide additional complex habitat. And the canyons are a refuge for a number of species. And a good example of that is the cusk. That was considered to be a fairly rare fish, and now we know that it has a refuge population in the canyons, and that's an important reason for protecting the canyons, which leads to 2 recent endeavors to protect these habitats. In 2016, President, yep.
I just want to give you a 5-minute notice.
That's what I thought, and I'm right on it. So President Obama in 2016, yikes. In 2016, designated this National Marine Monument to protect 3 canyons and 4 seamounts. In 2017, the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council and NOAA enacted a mechanism to protect a large area, including canyons and deep sea corals. Now, one thing I'll say about this is these are large areas, but we're still only protecting a very small percentage of the ocean bottom, and that's important to keep in mind. The other thing I will have to say is that these are not permanent mechanisms. The current administration has removed some of the protections for this national monument and has challenged the protections for a number of others. So as I get toward the end, I want to note that we have a continued interest in submarine canyons and their associated organisms now throughout the world. There are a lot of people working on these. That led to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management funding me and my colleagues to produce an atlas of canyons for the whole country. And we're hoping this will serve as a reference to spur on additional research. And with that, I'll end my talk.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was amazing to see all these little critters. If we insist, we'll take some questions. Yep, we do have, we definitely have time for some questions now. So please go ahead and put those in the chat box. And while we're waiting for that, I just wanted to ask Steve, of all your 44 cruises that you've done, what has most surprised you, or what's been the most exciting thing that you've ever seen down there?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot, and it's always, I've never had a great answer for that, because even in my last cruise, I generated just about the same amount of excitement as I did in my first cruise. I've never been on a deep sea cruise where I didn't discover something new. And that's why working in the deep sea is perhaps more exciting than some other places, because it's so poorly known. Nearly every time, we don't always recognize that something's new until we work on the data back at the laboratory, but quite a lot of the times while we're out there at sea, we know that we are seeing something that nobody else has ever seen, and it's a big thing. And that's always generated a lot of excitement amongst me and all my colleagues.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique opportunity to be able to see that. And I know a lot of us have enjoyed when the Okeanos Explorer has been down there doing the live streaming of what they're seeing. It's just been so amazing. It's like Dr. Seuss land down there.
Yeah.
I think creatures you can't imagine. So I'm not seeing any questions in the question box. So we'll give folks another minute or two if they have any questions in there for you. It's a great opportunity to ask someone who's had this kind of experience. But I wonder too, oh, here's a question. Let's see, from Ariane Browning is saying she wants to thank you for the presentation, and she wonders what's next, both for you and the canyons you've mapped, and how can we increase protections of the canyons?
Well, as to the latter, go out and vote. And I think you may know what I mean by that. Supporting, having your political constituents know that this is important to you is a step in the right direction. Too often, the people that are vocal are the people that are against protecting these resources. So, that's certainly one thing you can do. As far as what's next for us, we're continually building off what we've already learned, and everything we learn generates a new set of questions. I did mention that OceanGate is working out there. NOAA continues to work out there. I'm going to be working with both groups. We hope to explore Hudson Canyon a little bit further because it's a large canyon. I'm also working with the Canadians in their canyon to the north, the Gully. That'll make a great comparison to the mid-Atlantic because it's so far north and the ecosystems are somewhat different. So we're continuing to explore this area.
Great. What would you tell young people to study if they wanted to become a deep sea explorer?
Well, The curriculum in oceanography is the place where you have to start, biological and physical and chemical oceanography. But one of the best things you can do is to probably try to find professors, researchers who are actually out there doing the work, make a connection with those people personally, and see if you can volunteer. I've used quite a number of volunteers in our work, and quite often that's led to graduate school, and quite often that's led to jobs. I've had a number of interns that just wanted to sit in my lab for a week. Sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't, but it's very valuable when it does work out.
Great. I wonder too, some of us have been working a lot on marine debris and plastics in the ocean. How much evidence have you seen of plastics reaching the canyons?
There's a lot, and I'm working with a student now to analyze our data for marine debris. And as I said in the beginning, the canyons tend to funnel material from the shelf to the deep sea. And particularly in the upper part of the canyon, we see a lot of trash. Plastics are wrapped around corals. I decided not to show many pictures of that today, or not to make that an emphasis. Discarded fishing gear is common. Traps, lines, nets, but lots of plastic. And now we're learning worldwide that plastic is a major input to the oceans everywhere. Even the deep sea sediments are now full of plastics, microplastics that have disintegrated.
Yeah.
So yes, it's quite noticeable.
Yeah, very troubling. I think we have time for one more question. Susie Rosa is asking, as fish migrate north as a result of climate change, do you find that they vacate their previous homes that are also becoming warmer?
We're still learning about that. We're not really sure. I mean, that's a great question, because you could visualize this as the whole population shifting north, or you could visualize it as the population just expanding and maintaining its old territory and going into new territory. And we're not really sure yet. It's difficult to collect this kind of data because we're covering such a large area, and the surveys sometimes the data is variable. So we're not really sure what the answer to that is, but it could go either way. But we do know that fish are moving into what used to be colder waters. We do know that part. We just are not sure if the whole population is shifting. This is not always bad, but it certainly it's happening fast. It's happening faster than it should. And there's a little concern in that we don't really know what the implications are going to be.
Yeah, certainly makes fishery management more complicated. Not sure where they're going to go, and yeah, and what the allocations should be for each state and so forth. Very, very complicated.
Yes.
We thank you so much, Steve. We wanted to leave a few minutes for a poll, but again, thank you, Steve, so much for your presentation today. And again, for folks listening, we are recording this, so you'll be able to see that. So we are pulling up this poll here. We're curious what other topics for a webinar you would like to see. So if you can go ahead and click on your preferences there. And while you're doing that, again, I thank you very much, Steve. And we want to thank the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for their support of Marco and all the work that we do. I failed to mention, I think I never even told you, I'm Laura McKay. I'm with the Virginia CCM program and sit on the Marco Management Board. But we appreciate all our board members who put in time and staff to make these webinars work. So thank you, Christy and Judy. So while hopefully you're filling in that poll, and in a minute or two, we will share the results of that. And Christy, if you can talk to me, if you're unmuted, let me know. I'm not sure that I will see the results because I think I'm an organizer.
Hi, Laura. Hi, everybody. This is Christy. I also work with Marco. I'm from New York. Right now, we have 68% that have voted. It's kind of slowed down, so I'm not sure how many more we're going to get, but for those of you that are waiting, Laura, do you want to tell them about our final, oh,
I
here they
do.
are. We can go
Oh,
over these
there's the
and then we can
results.
talk about our final webinar in November.
All right. Well, it looks like we have a pretty even split here on the results. So Christy, that might mean we need to do 3 more.
It looks like we might have to.
Great. All right. Well, thanks very much for that. Kate behind the scenes who is running that poll for us. And I think we have a next slide to tell you about our next planned webinar we're very excited about. That's going to talk about how the canyons are important as whale habitat. So again, I hope you've enjoyed the webinar today. We're so happy to be able to put this on for you and hope you'll stay with us and tell your friends about the next one, November 5th at 1 o'clock. We're going to have Howard Rosenbaum from Columbia University and Andy Reid from Duke presenting there. So that's going to be a terrific webinar too. So with that, we'll say goodbye and thank you very much.